Samuel sighed as he went about his weekly routine of straightening up his father's home. It had been a while since he had moved to the old house to help his dad, Charles, as his health began to decline. Charles was a reserved man, hard to read but always responsible, a rock-solid figure in Samuel's life. Their relationship was a comfortable silence, a mutual respect that seldom required words. On this particular evening, after sweeping up the remnants of lunch, Samuel sat down at the kitchen table with a sense of nostalgia, sifting through an old drawer that hadn't been opened in years. Most of what he found was typical: bills, a few faded recipe cards, some tools, and a small collection of coins. But just as he was about to close the drawer, something else caught his eye. His father's old wallet, tucked away in the far corner, as though intentionally hidden. Samuel hesitated. His father's wallet was like an extension of the man himself. Worn, sturdy, and filled with secrets he'd never bothered to share. Charles never left the house without it, but this one seemed to be a backup, a relic of the past he hadn't used in years. Curiosity piqued. Samuel reached for it, feeling its leathery surface, familiar and foreign all at once. He opened it gently, as though handling a fragile memory. Inside, there were a few crumpled bills, an ancient-looking grocery list, and tucked into a side pocket, a single photograph. The photo was yellowed with age, creased in a way that suggested it had been carried and held many times. As Samuel lifted it closer, he felt a strange tug in his heart. A faint ache he couldn't place. The image was simple. His father, much younger, stood with his arm around a woman Samuel didn't recognize. Her expression was solemn, her gaze intense, almost haunting. She wore a dress that was out of fashion even for back then, and her face bore a striking resemblance to someone Samuel couldn't quite identify. The resemblance was almost familiar, yet entirely unknown, but it was the look on his father's face that struck him. Charles looked tense, almost burdened, as if he were carrying the weight of something unspoken. This wasn't the easygoing, even-tempered man Samuel had always known. There was something haunted in those eyes. Something his father had never shared with him. "Who is she?" Samuel muttered aloud, as though the photograph might respond. He studied every detail, hoping a memory or story would surface. But nothing came. The question gnawed at him, raising more with each passing minute. With a deep breath, Samuel slid the photograph back into the wallet, his mind now restless. He resolved to ask his father about it, though he already knew that getting answers from Charles wouldn't be easy. His father was a man of few words, and whatever this photo represented, it was something he'd clearly kept private for decades. That night, Samuel found it hard to sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, the image of his father and the mysterious woman drifted back to him. He tried to piece together who she might be: a friend, a relative, a lost love, but each idea felt wrong, incomplete. The next morning, over breakfast, Samuel decided to broach the subject. Charles was sitting quietly at the table as usual, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. Samuel joined him, hesitating, and then finally spoke. "Dad, I found something yesterday when I was cleaning up." He paused, measuring his words. "An old photo of you with a woman." Charles looked up, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Samuel thought he saw a flicker of surprise, perhaps even a touch of fear in his father's eyes. But just as quickly it was gone, replaced by the same steady, composed look that Charles always wore. "Oh, that," Charles said. "Charles." His tone dismissive. "Just an old friend." Samuel wasn't satisfied. There was something in his father's voice, a hesitation that hinted at something deeper. "She looks familiar. I mean, there's something about her." Charles's grip on his coffee cup tightened and he looked away, his gaze fixed on the window. After a long silence, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Some memories are best left in the past, Sam. It wasn't the answer he was hoping for, but it was enough to confirm his suspicion. This woman was more than just an old friend. Determined, Samuel made up his mind. If his father wouldn't tell him, he'd have to find out on his own. Samuel couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him since he'd seen that photograph. He found himself gazing at his father with a mixture of curiosity and bewilderment, trying to reconcile the man he knew with the one in that photograph. Who was that woman? And what part had she played in his father's life? As the days passed, Samuel's determination grew stronger. He wanted to know more, but he sensed that bringing it up with his father again wouldn't be easy. Charles had always been a man who lived firmly in the present, keeping his past close, protected and rarely spoken of. But the photograph haunted Samuel, and he was determined to find out more. After days of wondering and guessing, Samuel decided to try another approach. He began asking around, reaching out to family members who might know something. He started with his Aunt Lillian, his father's older sister, who was known for her sharp memory and love for family stories. He called her one morning and casually brought up the subject. "Aunt Lillian," he said, trying to keep his voice light, "I came across an old photo of Dad the other day. He's with a woman I didn't recognize." She looked, well, let's just say she didn't seem like just a friend. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, followed by a soft sigh. "Oh, Sam," Lillian replied, her voice carrying a weight he hadn't expected. "Some things are best left in the past. Your father, he's been through a lot. It's not my place to talk about his secrets." Samuel's curiosity only intensified with her words. "Aunt Lillian, please. I just want to understand. It feels like there's something big here, something he never told me. I don't mean to pry, but it's hard to just ignore it." After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "That woman in the photograph, her name was Margaret, and yes, she was important to your father, very important once upon a time. But that's all I can say, Samuel. Your father should be the one to tell you the rest." Margaret. The name lingered in Samuel's mind long after they ended the call. It was the first piece of real information he had, but it only led to more questions. Who was Margaret, and why had his father kept her existence hidden for all these years? Unable to let it go, Samuel decided to dig deeper. He returned to his father's house and carefully searched through drawers, boxes, and old keepsakes. Most of what he found was just the usual clutter of a life lived: yellowed receipts, faded postcards, and a few trinkets from family vacations. But then, tucked away in a box at the back of his father's closet, he found an envelope labeled M. Inside was a letter. Samuel's hands trembled as he unfolded it, reading the neat, careful handwriting that seemed so different from his father's usual scrawl. The letter was short, but it spoke volumes. "Dear Charles, I'll never forget what we had. I'll carry our memories with me always, though I know we were never meant to last. Take care of yourself and please, don't ever look back. It's best for everyone." No signature, no date, just a single sentence at the end that sent a chill down Samuel's spine. Some secrets are better kept buried for both our sakes. Samuel stared at the letter, his heart pounding. This was more than just a past relationship. This was something his father had wanted to erase. A part of his life he'd hidden so deeply that Samuel had never seen a hint of it until now. As he sat there, alone in his father's closet, Samuel realized that he was on the verge of uncovering something dark, something his father had buried long ago. But as much as he wanted to know the truth, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that maybe, Just maybe Aunt Lillian was right. Some things were better left in the past, but Samuel had come too far to turn back now. Days passed, and Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret held the key to something profound in his father's life. Her name lingered in his mind like a haunting melody. And the letter he had discovered felt like a doorway to a world his father had kept hidden. Determined to dig deeper, Samuel decided to visit the town mentioned in his father's old documents. The small town lay an hour's drive from his father's house. It was a quiet place, wrapped in mist and nostalgia. As if it hadn't changed in decades, Samuel parked near the town square and looked around, feeling a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. He found the local library, hoping to search through archives for any information about the mysterious Margaret or the event that had been so carefully buried. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper, and the librarian, a kind woman in her 70s, offered him a warm smile as he approached. Samuel explained that he was researching a family matter from years ago and asked if there were any records on local events or newspapers from several decades back. The librarian's expression changed subtly, as if she understood something he hadn't said. "We do have some old records, yes. If you're patient, I'll show you where to find them," she said, leading him to a back room filled with boxes of dusty newspapers and old binders. For hours, Samuel combed through the archives, his eyes scanning the yellowed pages for anything familiar. He was nearly ready to give up when an article from the local newspaper, dated over 30 years ago, caught his eye. The headline read, "Tragic accident claims lives in quiet town." His heart raced as he read. The article described an accident involving several young adults on a remote road near the town's outskirts. It mentioned that one of the survivors had left town immediately after the tragedy, leaving the townspeople in shock and speculation. Although the details were vague, one name stood out: Margaret Fields. Margaret was one of the survivors, but it seemed she'd disappeared from the town soon after. There was little more information, and Samuel felt a pang of disappointment. Still, it was a clue, one that led him to believe that Margaret and his father had been linked through this tragic incident. It also raised questions. Why had his father never mentioned this? What kind of accident was severe enough to drive people away, leaving scars so deep they would never heal? Samuel left the library, his mind reeling with questions. The afternoon sun was setting, casting long shadows across the town. He was about to head back to his car when he noticed an elderly man sitting alone on a bench, staring off into the distance. Something about the man's expression caught Samuel's attention, a look of sorrow, as if he too were carrying a weight from the past. Summoning his courage, Samuel approached the man. "Excuse me, sir," he said. "I'm looking into something from many years ago. A woman named Margaret Fields. She was involved in an accident here. Do you happen to know anything about it?" The man's eyes flickered with recognition. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I remember Margaret," he said, his voice hoarse and laden with memories. "Beautiful girl, but after the accident, she was never the same. None of them were." Samuel listened intently as the man continued. "There were rumors about why the accident happened. Some folks said it was just bad luck, but others thought it was something darker. Margaret left town, but not before making sure certain things would never be spoken of again. Your father was part of that, wasn't he?" The question startled Samuel. The man's knowing gaze seemed to reach into the very heart of the mystery Samuel was unraveling. He nodded, unsure of what else to say. The man sighed. "Then you already know, son. There are some ghosts that never let go." With that, he stood up, gave Samuel a brief, sad smile, and walked away. leaving Samuel alone with his thoughts and a chilling sense that he was uncovering something that might be best left buried. Samuel's heart felt heavier with each new revelation, but he knew there was no turning back now. The trip to the town and the talk with the old man had shown him glimpses of a past his father had kept hidden. He needed answers, and he was determined to get them, even if it meant confronting his father directly. Returning to his father's house, Samuel felt a mixture of dread and resolve. Charles was sitting in his usual spot in the living room, a book in his hands. He looked up as Samuel entered, his face calm yet unreadable. But Samuel could sense a tension there just beneath the surface. "Dad," Samuel began, his voice steady but serious, "I need to talk to you about something important." Charles closed his book, setting it aside. He gave Samuel a long, searching look, as if he already knew what was coming. After a moment, he nodded. "Go on." Samuel took a deep breath. "I know about Margaret." The silence that followed was thick and filled with tension. Charles's expression changed, his face hardening as if bracing himself against something painful. He looked away, his gaze fixed on a distant point as though he was seeing something far beyond the room they were in. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I found a letter," Samuel replied, "and I went to the town where you used to live. People remember her, Dad. They remember the accident." Charles's jaw tightened, and for a moment Samuel thought he saw a glimmer of regret, or was it fear? "Samuel," he said, his voice weary, "some things are better left buried. There are pieces of my past that don't need to be uncovered. They don't change anything now. But they change everything for me," Samuel replied, his voice rising. "You kept this huge part of your life a secret. You've always been a mystery to me. And now that I've found out even a part of the truth, I need to understand the rest." Charles was silent for a long time. He seemed to be struggling with something deep inside, wrestling with memories that he had locked away for decades. Finally, he looked back at Samuel, his eyes filled with a sadness Samuel had never seen before. "All right," he said quietly, "you deserve to know." He motioned for Samuel to sit down, and after a long, heavy sigh, he began to speak. "Margaret and I, we were young, reckless, and in love. It was a time in my life when I thought anything was possible. We made promises to each other, dreams we thought would last forever. But life, as it does, had other plans." Samuel listened intently, hardly daring to breathe. "There was an accident," Charles continued, his voice low and strained. "One night we were out with friends, just driving and laughing, and then, suddenly, everything went wrong. We lost control and people died. Friends we cared about. In an instant, everything changed." Samuel felt a pang of sympathy for his father, but there was still a part of him that needed more. "And Margaret?" "Margaret survived, but she was never the same," Charles said, his gaze distant. "The accident, it scarred her in ways that I couldn't fix. She left town soon after, but not before making us all swear never to speak of what happened. She didn't want to be remembered that way. She wanted to escape it, and I respected her wishes." "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Samuel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Charles sighed. "Because some memories are too painful to relive. I wanted to protect you from that part of my life. I wanted you to see me as your father, not as a man who made terrible mistakes." "But Dad," Samuel said, "I want to know all of you, even the parts that are hard to talk about. You don't have to carry this burden alone." For the first time, Samuel saw his father's stoic expression soften. And he thought he glimpsed a side of him that had been hidden all these years, a side that had been haunted by loss, regret, and the weight of choices made long ago. Charles nodded slowly, and as they sat there in silence, Samuel felt a sense of connection to his father that he'd never experienced before. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The truth had started to come out, but there were still shadows, still questions that lingered unanswered. Samuel knew that his father's confession was only part of the story. The accident had been devastating, that much was clear, but there was something else, a layer of secrecy and pain that Charles had barely touched on. Samuel sensed that Margaret's departure and the pact of silence had a significance his father had not fully explained. Despite feeling closer to his father, the unanswered questions lingered, pushing Samuel to dig further. He decided to reach out to someone who might have more insight. The next day, Samuel made a trip to visit Aunt Lillian, the sister who had shown a hesitation when he'd first mentioned the photo. If anyone had details about what happened back then, she would be the one to ask. When Samuel arrived, Lillian welcomed him warmly, though he could see a hint of apprehension in her eyes. Over tea, he explained his conversation with Charles, careful with his words, but honest about his need for clarity. Lillian listened in silence, her gaze turning pensive as she processed the memories. Finally, she sighed and set her teacup down. Your father. He's carried that story with him like a wound that never healed. I'm surprised he told you as much as he did. I think he wanted to shield you from the darkest parts. What could be darker than an accident that took his friends' lives? Samuel asked, his tone both gentle and insistent. Lillian hesitated, choosing her words carefully. The accident was tragic. Yes, but there was more to it than that. Margaret, she was a complicated woman. She and your father shared something deep, but also fragile. After the accident, it wasn't just grief that made her leave. There were suspicions. People in town whispered about what really happened that night, about choices made in the panic and chaos. Samuel felt a chill run through him. What kind of choices? Lillian looked down at her hands, as if gathering courage. I can't say for sure, but I know that Margaret felt responsible in some way. She became withdrawn, distant, like she was trying to bury the past herself. When she left, she made it clear that if anyone ever tried to bring up that night, she would deny everything. I think your father honored that because he felt he owed her, or maybe because he was hiding something of his own. Samuel sat back, stunned. So it wasn't just an accident. There was more. Lillian nodded slowly. I think that night shattered them all in ways that none of them were ever able to fix. Your father, Margaret, the others, they each bore a different piece of it, each one blaming themselves. It's why your father became the way he is, so reserved, so intent on leaving the past behind. Samuel's mind swirled with the implications. He thought about his father's quiet demeanor, his reluctance to share his feelings. Now he saw it in a different light. Charles's silence wasn't just a personality trait, it was a shield, a way of coping with a past that had scarred him deeply. I wish he had told me sooner, Samuel said softly, more to himself than to Lillian. Maybe he thought he was protecting you, Lillian said gently. Sometimes people believe that silence is the kindest way to spare someone from pain, but silence also has a way of growing heavier over time. Samuel nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He was starting to see his father differently, not just as a man who kept secrets, but as someone who had been shaped by tragedy. Regret and the bonds of loyalty and loss. He realized that his father's silence wasn't just about hiding the truth. It was a reflection of his own unresolved guilt. As he prepared to leave, Aunt Lillian placed a hand on his arm. Samuel, be gentle with him. Sometimes the wounds we can't see are the hardest to heal. Samuel thanked her and left with a newfound understanding. On the drive home, He thought about his father, about Margaret, and about the years of silence that had stood between them. He still had questions, but now he felt a growing sense of compassion. Perhaps, in the end, his father's secrets were not meant to isolate him, but to shield him from the past. But Samuel knew that he couldn't let it rest. He had to honor his father's past and his own need for answers, no matter where it led him. Samuel returned home with Lillian's words echoing in his mind, the gravity of his father's past weighing more heavily than ever. He now understood that Margaret's influence on his father was profound, but also shrouded in pain and regret. The accident, the whispered suspicions, and the pact of silence among those involved. It all added up to a chapter of his father's life that had left a permanent scar. But Samuel wasn't satisfied. There was still something missing, an unspoken truth that hovered just out of reach. Determined to get to the heart of it, Samuel found himself returning to the old town once more, this time to dig deeper into any records that might still hold clues about that fateful night. The town's public records office was quiet when Samuel arrived. After explaining his research to the clerk, he was shown to a small room filled with dusty file cabinets and boxes of documents from decades past. Samuel spent hours combing through files until he found something intriguing, a police report from the night of the accident. The report described a crash involving 3 vehicles on a narrow road near a wooded area. According to the report, visibility had been poor, and it seemed that reckless driving had been involved. But one detail caught Samuel's attention. The report mentioned an anonymous tip that had claimed the crash was no mere accident. The caller had suggested that there had been a confrontation between the passengers before the vehicles collided, and that it may have been an act of anger or revenge gone horribly wrong. Samuel read the line over and over, his heart pounding. Could it be possible? Had there been more to that night than just an unfortunate crash? The police report ended without further detail, leaving the mystery unresolved. But the implications were enough to fill Samuel with a sense of dread. Who had called in that tip, and why had the truth never come to light? Still holding the report, Samuel was startled by a voice behind him. An elderly woman, who appeared to be a long-time employee of the records office, was peering over his shoulder. "You must be Charles's son," she said quietly. "I remember that night very well. Most of us here do." Samuel looked up, surprised. "You knew my father?" "Oh, yes," she replied, her voice tinged with sadness. "Everyone in town knew what happened. We all knew about the pact to keep it quiet. Those young ones, they were carrying too much guilt for people so young." Samuel swallowed, sensing that she had more to tell. The woman continued, "The night of the crash, Margaret was devastated. She felt like it was all her fault. Some thought she had done something reckless, pushed someone too far. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't. None of us could ever really know. But she convinced Charles and the others to take a vow, to keep what happened a secret. She thought it would protect them all." Samuel was stunned. The pact had been Margaret's idea, a desperate attempt to shield them from the consequences of that night. But the weight of that secret had evidently followed them, haunting his father all these years. "Why didn't they ever break the silence?" Samuel asked, barely able to comprehend it. The woman sighed, looking down at her hands. "They thought it would be better that way. The memories were painful enough without dragging them into the light. But Charles, he carried that silence like a curse. I think Margaret felt it too, wherever she ended up. They were bound by that night in ways that none of us could understand." As Samuel left the records office, the pieces began to fall into place. The silence, the regret, his father's reserved nature, all of it made sense now. Margaret and Charles hadn't simply been keeping a secret, They had been protecting each other from the guilt, the blame, and the haunting memory of that tragic night. But as he drove back, Samuel realized something crucial. The silence hadn't protected them. Instead, it had cast a shadow over their lives, isolating his father from his own family. And now, Samuel had to decide whether to let the past remain buried or to try to heal the wounds by breaking that silence. Back at his father's house, Samuel sat alone in the dim light of the living room, sifting through everything he had discovered. His mind was awash with the pieces he had gathered. Margaret's departure, the police report hinting at a heated confrontation, and the pact of silence that had bound his father and his friends. Each revelation added a new layer of complexity. Yet there remained a final piece of the puzzle that eluded him. The only person left who might know the full story was his father. And after hearing the story from the records clerk, Samuel decided he could no longer put off confronting Charles about what he had found. He needed to understand not just the facts, but the emotions and choices that had led his father down this path of silence and secrecy. The next morning, Samuel found Charles in the backyard, working in the garden. The simple, familiar scene felt almost surreal, given the weight of what they were about to discuss. Samuel hesitated, but then gathered his courage. "Dad," he began, his voice steady, "I went back to the town. I saw the police report. I know about the anonymous tip, about the fight that happened that night." Charles froze, his hands stilled in the dirt. Slowly, he looked up, his face clouded with a mixture of resignation and pain. "You were never supposed to know any of this." "Sam," he said, his voice hoarse, "I tried to leave that night behind me. Margaret and we thought it was better that way." Samuel stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "But Dad, it didn't stay in the past. You've carried this burden all these years. It's affected you, our family. I need to know the truth." "What really happened?" Charles took a deep breath, wiping his hands on his jeans as he sat down on a nearby bench. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, his gaze distant. Then, slowly, he began to speak. "That night was supposed to be like any other. We were all young and reckless, maybe even foolish. Margaret and we were close, but there was tension between her and some of the others, old rivalries, hurt feelings. I didn't think much of it then, but looking back, maybe I should have." Samuel listened closely, his heart pounding. "There was an argument," Charles continued. "Margaret said things she couldn't take back. Words were exchanged, and one of our friends, he took it personally. He was angry, hurt, and in that moment he acted on impulse. I don't remember exactly how it happened, but the car swerved, and everything spiraled out of control." Charles's voice faltered, and he looked down, as if he could still see the chaos of that night unfolding before him. People died because of that moment of anger. Friends we'd laughed with, people we'd grown up with, and all we were left with was the guilt and the silence. Samuel felt a wave of sorrow and understanding. The pact of silence wasn't just about hiding the truth. It was about preserving the fragile pieces of the people who survived. They had each been broken in their own way, bound by guilt and memories too painful to revisit. "And Margaret?" Samuel asked softly. Charles looked away, his eyes clouded with regret. Margaret felt responsible. She thought if she left, if she vanished from our lives, it would help us all forget. She asked us to make that vow because she believed it would save us, but in reality it only left us haunted. Samuel took a deep breath, absorbing his father's words. The silence that had once felt like a barrier now felt like a way of surviving. He realized that his father had been trying to protect him, not by hiding the truth, but by sparing him the same pain and guilt that had weighed on him and Margaret all these years. "Dad," Samuel said, his voice choked with emotion, I'm sorry you had to carry this alone." Charles looked at him, his face softening. "I thought I was doing the right thing. Sam, I thought I was protecting you from a past that I could never change. But maybe I should have told you sooner." In that moment, Samuel saw the vulnerability in his father's eyes, the regret and the hope that his son might understand. They sat together in silence, side by side, two generations sharing the weight of a secret that had shaped both their lives. Samuel knew that understanding didn't erase the pain, but it did bring a measure of peace. The silence that had once divided them now felt different, like a bridge, a connection forged through honesty and acceptance. For the first time, Samuel felt that he truly knew his father, not just as a parent, but as a man. But as they sat there, Samuel also knew that this was just the beginning. The healing would take time, and some parts of the past would remain painful, yet together they could face it, father and son, no longer separated by silence. In the days following his father's confession, Samuel found himself reflecting on everything Charles had shared. The secrets, the regrets, the burden of guilt, all of it was finally out in the open, and though it was painful, Samuel sensed that it marked the beginning of a healing process neither he nor his father had anticipated. Yet, there was one lingering thought that haunted him. Margaret. What had become of her? Had she carried the same weight of guilt and regret all these years? Charles had mentioned that she left town shortly after the accident, but he had no idea where she had gone. Samuel felt a growing urge to find her, not just for himself, but for his father, and maybe even for Margaret herself. After a few days of searching through old directories and making phone calls, Samuel finally managed to trace her to a quiet coastal town 2 hours away. It was a small community, the kind of place where people sought refuge, where memories could be lost to the sound of the waves. Taking a deep breath, he decided to make the trip, telling his father he needed to clear his mind, but omitting the reason why. He wasn't sure how Charles would feel about him reopening a wound that had barely started to heal. Samuel arrived in the early afternoon, his heart pounding as he approached the modest house where Margaret was said to live. He hesitated, then knocked on the door. Moments later it opened, and an older woman stood before him. Her face was lined with age, yet there was a familiar depth in her eyes, an intensity he recognized from the photograph he had found. "Margaret?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. She studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Yes, and you must be Samuel." Her voice held both surprise and an underlying sadness, as if she had expected this moment for a long time. They sat together on her porch, overlooking the sea, and Margaret listened as Samuel recounted his journey of discovery. She didn't interrupt, only nodding occasionally. Her eyes focused somewhere far off, as though watching memories unfold over the waves. When he finished, she took a deep breath. "I wondered if this day would ever come," she said quietly. "If anyone would come looking for the truth. It's not an easy thing to confront, is it?" Samuel shook his head, feeling the weight of her words. "No, but I needed to understand. I think my father did too, in his own way. It's been hard for him. For both of you, I imagine." Margaret looked down, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the armrest. "After the accident, I thought leaving would protect everyone. I thought if I disappeared, people would forget and the pain would fade. But I was wrong. The memories followed me, no matter where I went. You can't run from guilt, Samuel. It stays with you, reshaping your life in ways you never expect." Her voice was heavy with regret, and Samuel could see that the years hadn't softened the pain. He realized that Margaret had been as haunted as his father, living with the same shadow of that tragic night. "I don't think my father has ever truly forgiven himself," Samuel said gently. "He's been carrying that guilt all these years." Margaret's gaze softened, and she reached out to place a hand on Samuel's. "Tell him, he doesn't have to carry it alone anymore. What happened was terrible, yes, but we were all young. We made mistakes. We suffered, and we've paid for those mistakes with the lives we've led since then. But it's time to let go. If we can't forgive ourselves, what hope do we have?" Samuel nodded, her words settling deep within him. He could feel the weight of her sadness, but he also sensed a new resolve, a willingness to let go of the pain that had bound her to the past. As they parted, Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder, looking into his eyes. "Take care of him, Samuel, and take care of yourself. You both deserve to live without this shadow." Driving back home, Samuel felt lighter. He had found something unexpected in Margaret, a quiet strength, a sense of forgiveness that he hadn't anticipated. He knew that he would share her words with his father, that he would help him find peace with the choices of the past. For the first time, he felt that they might finally be able to move forward. Returning home, Samuel was filled with a newfound sense of purpose. Margaret's words had lifted something inside him, a lingering heaviness he hadn't realized he was carrying. Her message of self-forgiveness and the chance to move on inspired him. And he knew it was time to share this revelation with his father. He hoped that Margaret's message would offer Charles the peace he had been denied for so long. That evening, Samuel found his father in the living room, sitting quietly in his favorite armchair. The weight of the years was visible on Charles's face, etched in every line and every thoughtful, silent glance toward the window. Taking a seat across from him, Samuel felt the familiar, comforting silence settle around them before he spoke. "Dad," he began, his tone gentle, "I met Margaret." Charles looked up, surprise flashing across his face, followed quickly by a wave of emotions, relief, sadness, and perhaps even a trace of hope. He took a deep breath and nodded, as if somehow he had always known that Samuel would find her. "She wanted me to tell you something," Samuel continued. "She said that you don't have to carry this burden alone anymore. That what happened was something you both paid for, and it's time to let it go." Charles's eyes softened, and for a long time, he said nothing. Samuel could see the words sinking in, working their way through the walls his father had built around his heart for so many years. Finally, Charles nodded slowly, his gaze distant as he processed the message. "It's strange," Charles murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was doing the right thing by keeping it all locked away. I thought if I buried it deep enough, it would fade. But it never did, not really." Samuel reached over, placing a comforting hand on his father's shoulder. "Maybe it's not supposed to fade, Dad. Maybe it's something we carry with us, but it doesn't have to control us anymore. You've held on to this for so long, but it's okay to let it go now." For the first time in Samuel's life, he saw tears in his father's eyes. Charles turned away, struggling to maintain his composure. But the emotions were too strong, too raw to suppress. The decades of silence, guilt, and regret seemed to unravel in that single moment, as if the walls Charles had built around his heart were finally coming down. "I thought if I kept quiet, it would protect you," Charles said, his voice breaking. "I wanted you to have a life untouched by my mistakes." Samuel's heart ached with empathy. "But Dad, I'm part of this family. We can't change the past, but we can face it together. We don't have to pretend anymore." Charles looked at him, the weight of his pain and regret laid bare. "Thank you, Sam," he whispered, his voice full of gratitude and relief. I don't know how I would have faced this without you." They sat together in silence for a long while, both lost in their thoughts, each one absorbing the release and peace that came with forgiveness. The shadows that had haunted Charles's life were still there, but they no longer felt as daunting. In sharing the truth with his son, he had found a way to lighten his burden. That night, Samuel felt a new closeness with his father, a bond that transcended their shared blood and history. It was as though they had finally met as equals, as two people bound by love, understanding, and the strength to let go. For the first time, they both felt a future unburdened by the weight of the past was possible. And as they sat together, they knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. In the weeks that followed, Samuel and Charles began to rebuild their relationship in ways neither had thought possible. The silence that had once separated them was replaced with conversations and laughter. Though the pain of the past remained, it no longer held them captive. They had learned to share their burdens, and in doing so, had forged a bond that was stronger and more resilient than ever. One evening, Samuel decided to take Charles to a quiet spot by the lake where they often went when he was a boy. The air was fresh and filled with the sounds of nature, and the sunset cast a golden glow over the water, creating a serene backdrop that felt both peaceful and healing. As they sat together, Charles turned to Samuel, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Sam," he said, his voice filled with gratitude, "for not giving up on me, for helping me find peace with everything that happened." Samuel smiled, his heart full. "You don't have to thank me, Dad. I'm just glad we could finally find a way to move on together." Charles looked out over the lake, his gaze distant but calm. "You know, for so long I thought that if I kept everything hidden, it would protect you, protect our family. But I see now that honesty, even when it's hard, is what brings us closer." They sat in a comfortable silence, letting the peace of the moment wash over them. The weight of years of secrets and guilt had been lifted, leaving them with a sense of renewal and hope. They both knew that the memories of the past would always be there, but they no longer defined their future. They were free to build new memories, ones rooted in trust, understanding, and forgiveness. As the last light of day began to fade, Charles placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder. "I want you to have something," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the old, worn wallet, the same one Samuel had found months before. Inside, he carefully placed the photograph that had started it all. Samuel took the wallet, understanding the gesture for what it was, a symbol of closure, a passing of the torch, and an acknowledgement that the weight of the past no longer had to rest solely on his father's shoulders. "I'll keep it safe," Samuel promised, tucking the wallet into his own pocket, "and I'll make sure our story, the real story, is remembered, but not as a burden, just as a part of who we are." Charles nodded, his eyes shining with pride. "That's all I could ever hope for, son." As they stood together, looking out over the lake, Samuel felt a deep sense of peace. For the first time, the pain of the past had been transformed into something else, an understanding, a connection, and a bridge that linked their histories with a brighter future. And as the stars began to appear in the night sky, father and son turned and walked back toward home, side by side, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it with the strength they had found in each other.